In this video, we're uncovering 5 chilling stories of owners who met their untimely deaths at the hands or paws of their own pets. From animals once seen as loyal companions to sudden and shocking fatal attacks, these disturbing cases will leave you questioning just how well we really know our furry, feathered, or scaly friends. Join us as we explore the darker, more unsettling side of pet ownership, where love turns lethal.
The beast landed on Kellyanne in one smooth bound. The air in Kelly's lungs whooshed out of her as almost 400 pounds rammed her to the ground. And by the time there was air in her lungs again to scream, Teddy had already had his jaws sunk into her shoulder.
It was October 4th, 2009 in Ross Township, Pennsylvania. In a steel and concrete cage tucked away behind a house on Dogwood Lane, a predator was waiting. Kellyanne, a 37-year-old mother of 2, had done this routine countless times before. Feed the animals, clean the cages, make sure everything was in order. It was second nature to her. After all, she wasn't just any animal lover, she was devoted. She and her husband Michael had filled their home with a breathtaking, some might say alarming, collection of exotic creatures. Lions, tigers, cougars, leopards, even reptiles and Old English bulldogs. But there was one animal that stood out, a 350-pound black bear named Teddy. Teddy wasn't a new addition. The Walls family had bought him back in 2000, raised him, cared for him, fed him. To Kellyanne, Teddy was more than a bear. He was part of the family. That morning, Kellyanne did what she always did. She stepped into the 15 by 15-foot enclosure, trying her usual trick, tossing dog food to one side of the cage to distract Teddy while she cleaned the other. It had worked every time before, but not this time. This time, something was different. Whether it was the season, October, when bears begin to feel the primal pull of hibernation, or something else entirely, Teddy snapped. In an instant, the animal Kellyanne had cared for over 9 years transformed from companion to killer. He lunged. He attacked. The scene turned violent and chaotic, and her children saw it all. Screaming, they ran for help, pounding on the door of a neighbor, Scott Caston, a schoolteacher. At first, Scott thought it was some sort of wild bear attack, but when he realized the horror unfolding just next door, that it was Teddy, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his .357 Magnum and rushed toward the Walls property. What he saw was pure terror. Teddy was on top of Kellyanne, who wasn't moving. Scott called out, tried to distract the bear, but Teddy turned his attention toward him. In that split second, faced with a choice between freezing or acting, Scott pulled the trigger. One shot to the head. The bear collapsed, dead. He ran to Kellyanne, bloodied, broken, still. He called 911, desperate for help, but it was too late. Kellyanne Walls died there, in the very cage she had entered with love and trust. The news sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once visited the Walls home to see the majestic animals, who brought their kids to marvel at lions and tigers just beyond steel bars, now recoiled in disbelief. A place once filled with fascination had become the site of a nightmare. In the days that followed, deeper questions rose. It was discovered that Michael Walls's permits to own and display exotic animals had expired over a year before the attack. Still, nothing had been done. Inspectors had found no serious violations. The cages were secure. The paperwork? Just a formality, they said, but no one could ignore what had happened. Not now. At Kellyanne's funeral, mourners packed the New Covenant World Outreach Church. The people of Ross Township came together not just to grieve, but to try to make sense of it all. How could a woman so loving, so passionate about animals meet such a fate? How could a creature she nurtured for nearly a decade become the very thing that took her away?
A man has been mauled to death by a lion at his family home in the eastern Czech Republic. Prask kept the 9-year-old big cat and another lioness for breeding in homemade enclosures in his backyard.
It was March 5th, 2019, in the village of Zdechov, tucked away in the hills of eastern Czech Republic. The air was still, But behind the walls of a private property, something horrific had already happened. Inside a homemade enclosure, Michael Prask, just 34 years old, lay lifeless, his body torn apart. His killer? Not a stranger, not a thief, but something far more chilling, his own pet lion. Michael wasn't just known in the village, he was feared. While most people in Zechov kept dogs or cats, Michael chose lions. Yes, lions. Full-grown, apex predators he housed in backyard cages built with his own hands. He claimed it was for breeding. The locals called it madness, and for years they begged someone, anyone, to do something, but no one could stop him. He bought the male lion from Slovakia in 2016, then a lioness 2 years later. Despite the constant complaints from terrified neighbors, despite mounting fines from the authorities, Michael kept his lions, fed them, walked them on leashes through the village like oversized pets. People looked on in disbelief. Parents pulled their kids inside, and still, nothing changed. In one shocking incident, a cyclist collided with Michael's lioness while she was out for one of those infamous walks. The cyclist was injured badly enough to need hospital care, yet the event was dismissed as nothing more than a traffic accident. The message was clear. Michael wasn't giving up his lions, and the law wasn't strong enough to force his hand. Officials tried. They cited him for building illegal enclosures, breeding without permits. But without evidence of animal cruelty, and without a safe place to relocate the lions, they were trapped in a legal deadlock. And Michael, he knew it. He refused them entry, shut the gates, shut the world out. Then came that Tuesday morning. At around 7 a.m., Michael's father approached the enclosure. What he saw would haunt him forever. His son's body, bloodied and motionless, was sprawled inside the lion's cage. The door was locked from the inside. That meant Michael had entered voluntarily. No one knows why. Maybe it was routine, maybe he thought he was safe. Maybe he truly believed that after years of raising these lions, they saw him as more than prey. He was wrong. When police arrived, the decision was brutal but unavoidable. The lions, especially the male, were dangerous, and Michael's lifeless body was still inside the cage. There was no other way. Both animals were shot and killed so authorities could reach him. A doctor on scene confirmed what everyone feared. Michael was dead. And then came the tragic twist. The lioness, she was pregnant. The village reacted with a strange mix of grief and grim relief. Michael was gone, and so were the lions. For the first time in years, parents didn't have to worry about a predator strolling past their child's school. But at what cost? Mayor Tomasz Kokurek said what many were already thinking, that maybe, just maybe, this tragedy would force the government to wake up. The Czech Republic had become a quiet hotspot for illegal wildlife smuggling and lax enforcement. And now, someone was dead. Michael Prask paid the ultimate price for his obsession. He believed he could tame nature, control it, build fences around it. But nature has no master. And in the end, the lions didn't forget who they were. Neither will anyone else. It was the morning of July 17th, 2006 in Salem Township, Pennsylvania. Sandra Piovesan, 50 years old, had entered the pen like she had done countless times before. To her, this wasn't just a cage, it was a sanctuary. Inside lived her beloved wolf-dog hybrids, 9 of them, each a massive, beautiful, dangerous crossbreed of wild and domestic blood. She loved them with a devotion few understood. But what Sandra didn't know was that she had just stepped into a trap. They had changed. Over the past year, the animals had grown more agitated, more territorial, more unpredictable. One of the older wolves had been torn apart by the others, but Sandra chalked it up to natural pack behavior. She believed she could manage them, control them. After all, she'd raised them for nearly a decade. Sandra had built them a playground, an odd mix of plastic igloos, balls, and a child's playhouse scattered across the dirt. To her, it was enrichment. To them, it was territory, dominance, survival. None of the animals had been spayed or neutered, and over the years, litters of pups had come and gone, all raised inside that enclosure, and all without proper oversight. She didn't hold a license from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Instead, she used basic dog licenses as a workaround, legal on paper, but reckless in practice. Neighbors complained about the smell, the noise, the rumors of unvaccinated animals, about the roadkill Sandra sometimes dragged in to feed them. People were scared. They kept their distance. They knew something wasn't right. But Sandra, she saw herself as their protector, their mother, their alpha. That morning, she stepped into the cage for the last time. When her daughter, Crystal, showed up later that day for breakfast, she sensed something was wrong. Sandra hadn't answered her calls. She wasn't picking up. So Crystal went to the house, pushed through the yard, and walked toward the enclosure. And what she saw shattered her world. Sandra's body lay motionless on the ground, torn and bloodied, surrounded by the very creatures she had loved. The grass was stained red. Her wounds were deep, bite marks, claw gashes. She had bled out alone inside the pen. State police responded quickly, but even from outside the enclosure, the danger was clear. The hybrids stalked along the fence line, eyes fixed, muscles tense. They moved together, like hunters. It was as if they weren't guarding Sandra's body, but claiming it. There was no choice. Authorities tranquilized the animals and later euthanized them all. It was the only way to recover Sandra's remains safely. The autopsy was grim but conclusive. She had died from the injuries inflicted by her own pets. People who knew Sandra weren't surprised. Heartbroken, yes, but not shocked. They had warned her, pleaded with her, but she always insisted that the animals were misunderstood, not monsters. Brian Gallagher, one of her closest friends, believed that the attack had been triggered by a shift in pack hierarchy. Maybe one of the wolves tried to take control. Maybe they all did. And in that moment, Sandra was no longer the caretaker, but the challenge. She didn't stand a chance. Her death sent shockwaves through the town, through the state, through every quiet neighborhood where someone might be keeping a wild animal behind a flimsy fence. It was a brutal reminder. No matter how much love you pour into them, some creatures aren't meant to be pets. They're not ours to control.
Switching gears now to Lehigh County, we have new details in that bizarre investigation after a pet snake wrapped itself around its owner's neck. You remember that story? Well, the 28-year-old owner has died.
It was a quiet evening on August 25, 2017, in Church Crookham, Hampshire. 31-year-old Dan Brandon was upstairs in his bedroom. Downstairs, his mother Babs was cooking dinner. The air smelled of spices and something warm and familiar. Nothing seemed out of place until they heard it. A crash. It was sudden, heavy, and sharp, like something had fallen hard, but no scream followed. After all, Dan's room was full of glass tanks, equipment, and enclosures. Maybe something had simply been knocked over. Dan Brandon had always been a little different. He wasn't just a pet owner, he was a devotee of the unusual. 10 snakes, 12 tarantulas. Creatures that made most people shudder, but to Dan, they were companions. He'd been raising reptiles since he was 15, 16 years of experience. He understood their habits, their needs, their temperaments. To many, it seemed reckless, but to Dan, it was a lifestyle. But among all his creatures, there was one that stood out. Tiny, an African rock python stretching 8 feet long, thick, muscular, and immensely powerful. Dan had raised her since she was small enough to wrap around his fingers. He called her his baby, often cradling her like a pet dog. But Tiny was no dog. African rock pythons are among the largest snakes in the world. Non-venomous, yes, but killers by design. They wrap their bodies around their prey, tighten with every breath, and squeeze the life out. Dan knew this. He respected this. In recent months, he'd even stopped placing Tiny around his neck. She had hissed at him occasionally, coiled defensively, even faked a strike once or twice. At 7:15, Babs called up to let Dan know dinner was ready. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. She asked her husband Derek to check on him. Derek went up the stairs, knocked once, then slowly pushed the bedroom door open, and what he found stopped him cold. Dan was lying face down on the floor, motionless. His body was cold to the touch. Panic erupted. Babs ran in behind, her eyes darting to the glass enclosures. Then she noticed it. Tiny's vivarium was empty. She was gone. Paramedics were called immediately. Dan was pronounced dead at the scene. His beloved python was eventually found, coiled tightly under a box in the corner of the room. An inquest was launched, desperate to answer a single, horrifying question. Did the snake kill him? Pathologist Dr. Adnan Al-Bad's findings were chilling. Dan had died from asphyxiation. There were hemorrhages behind one eye, blood vessels ruptured in his face and lungs, but no puncture wounds, no scratches, no broken bones, and no signs of a violent struggle. If Tiny had wrapped around Dan, she hadn't attacked him in a frenzy. She hadn't bitten, she hadn't fought. The theory formed like a shadow creeping under a locked door. Maybe she hadn't meant to kill him. Maybe it wasn't aggression at all. Coroner Andrew Bradley concluded the death was accidental. Tiny might have coiled around Dan, not out of hostility, but out of fear, or even routine behavior. Pythons don't feel affection the way dogs or cats might. They act on instinct, hunger, threat, movement. And sometimes, tragically, those instincts can misfire. Reptile expert Professor John Cooper examined Tiny and found no evidence of struggle on her body, no torn skin, no defensive wounds. If Dan had tried to pull her off, she hadn't resisted. Perhaps he never had the chance. He would have known what to do. He'd done it before, but maybe this time he was caught off guard. Maybe he passed out too quickly. Maybe the trust he had in Tiny clouded his reaction. No one really knows. Some experts still aren't convinced Tiny was the cause. The evidence wasn't definitive, but for Dan's parents, for his friends, for anyone who's ever looked into the eyes of an animal and believed love was enough, it didn't matter. Dan was gone.
70-year-old Terry Garner was last seen last Wednesday heading out to feed his hogs. After a few hours, a family member went out to check on Garner, only to find his dentures in his hog enclosure.
On the morning of September 26, 2012, Terry Vance Garner walked out to feed his hogs, just like he had done countless times before. It was a routine part of his life, a quiet ritual on the farm he loved. The same steps, the same path, the same animals. But this time, he never came back. Hours passed, and his absence began to weigh heavy on his family. Something was wrong. Terry was reliable, predictable, and above all else, he was devoted to those animals. So when he didn't return, a sinking feeling set in. They went looking for him, and what they found was beyond comprehension. In the middle of the hog pen, there was no sign of Terry, only fragments, bits of torn clothing, blood in the dirt, a pair of dentures half buried near the mud, and scattered remains. The rest of him was gone. The hogs, massive, some weighing over 700 pounds, moved around calmly, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something horrific. Terry Vance Garner wasn't just another farmer. He was a 69-year-old Vietnam War veteran, known in his Oregon community as kind-hearted and hardworking. But behind his gentle demeanor lived the scars of war. He suffered from PTSD. The battlefield had left its mark, but he'd found peace in the slow rhythm of farm life. The animals, the soil, the air, they were therapy. They gave him something the war never could: calm. His older brother, Michael, described him as compassionate. Even after being bitten by one of the hogs, an attack that happened after he accidentally stepped on a piglet, Terry didn't retaliate. He spared the animal. That was who he was. But pigs, even domesticated ones, are not harmless. They are strong, intelligent, and omnivorous. And when they're agitated or hungry, they are more than capable of violence. With jaws powerful enough to crush bone, they can turn deadly without warning. When the authorities arrived at the scene, they were shaken. The enclosure where Terry had spent years caring for his animals had become the site of his violent end. But how did it happen? There were theories. Maybe Terry had a medical emergency, a heart attack perhaps, collapsed in the pen, helpless, vulnerable. The hogs, confused or curious, could have overwhelmed him. That was one possibility. But there was another, a darker one. What if the pigs hadn't waited for him to fall? What if they'd knocked him down? What if something spooked them and instinct took over? What if, in a flash of fear or frenzy, they turned on him? The case was so bizarre that foul play wasn't entirely ruled out. District Attorney Paul Frazier admitted the situation was difficult to explain. There was no clear sign of struggle, no witnesses, no definitive cause of death. The remains that were left were too few. The local pathologist couldn't determine how Terry had died or even when. The family hoped for answers, but there were none. The case was sent to a forensic anthropologist at the University of Oregon for further analysis. But time passed, and clarity never came. What happened in those final moments, whether it was a tragic accident, a medical collapse, or something more violent, remained a mystery. And so the Garner family was left with not just grief, but something far worse: uncertainty. How do you mourn someone when you don't even know how they died? Terry's life, shaped by war and healed by nature, ended in the very place he sought refuge. The same animals that gave him comfort may have, in the end, betrayed him.